This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez here again with Adam Knott. Today we are going to be talking about libertarianism, what libertarian is. Adam is going to raise some ideas that he has that can refine our understanding of what libertarianism is. And based on that, we're going to talk about what that means for libertarians' strategy. And for me, the value of this discussion is to try to get a better understanding, to have a more clarity around what this cause that I've devoted, so much of my life toward actually means, and how best to advance it. And hopefully, viewer, that's what you can get out of it too. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with what either of us has to say. It also doesn't mean Adam or me agreeing with each other. I think these discussions are great because even in thinking and discussing about what we disagree with, that it forces us to forge why we disagree with it and what we believe instead. And for those things that we hadn't thought of before, then obviously that is another great way of learning and developing our understanding of libertarianism and how best to promote it. So, Adam, I'll start by asking you, what is one key dilemma faced by libertarians today?
Dan, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and makes me proud to be a libertarian. Such intelligent and well-spoken company. Well, kind of the problem of government, I guess we could say, is libertarianism 101. It's anybody who's a libertarian has gone through this kind of thinking or had a discussion with someone else about this, and that is, if libertarians are unhappy with the current situation, then what is their proposal for a government along libertarian lines? And what we could call the problem of government is the idea that is a conundrum that libertarians have, which is, if I agree on the principle of government intervention for any one issue, let's say public roads, or in order to have the military or a court system, it becomes very hard, or I would say even impossible, to make a principled stance against the expansion of government, because nature doesn't provide us with incremental dividing points between when you can use government to intervene. So if I justify government intervention for one thing, those same arguments that I use will be used to justify government intervention for the next most important issue. So then what that forces, if you're a libertarian social theory, it forces you then to say, okay, well then, what is a libertarian form of government that doesn't lead you down that path? And unless somebody can show me something, or unless in our discussion today we can come up with some examples that prove me wrong, I think in general libertarians haven't been able to propose a distinctly libertarian form of government. So what ends up happening is that the forms of maybe government that libertarians might propose, to the extent they exist, become kind of unrealistic. And actually no libertarian forms of government come to mind. Maybe you can help me with that. So it's this dilemma that part of the reason why libertarianism has struggled so much to gain a foothold is because we have this choice between either agreeing that government intervention is sometimes necessary, and once you agree on that, then there's no end to that, and that's how we ended up where we are today. Or if you're trying to come up with another theory of government that doesn't involve, in a sense, that doesn't involve coercion, let's say, that seems patently unrealistic. So, so I think where I'm going with this is I don't think we as libertarians have solved the problem of government. In other words, it's an unresolved issue about, we know intuitively, maybe we know what freedom is or what voluntary agreement is, but we don't, as a class of people or as a movement, have a theory of government or an adequate theory of government. So when we go through today and when we get to I think our last point, I'm going to suggest a theory of government that's appropriate for libertarians. But anyway, that's just a very simple problem. Any libertarian who starts off, this is not like advanced thinking or anything. It's just, well, you want a free society. So you want government not to keep making rules and restrictions that impede your freedom. So then put forth a libertarian theory of government. I challenge anyone to do that. And my contention is that there has been no successful attempt to do that. So how do you see that, Dan? Do you feel that there are one or two or more libertarian theories of government, or solving the problem that government solves, which is collective action? I mean, how do you see that? I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with the Declaration of Independence when it says that governments are instituted among men to secure rights. Or at least I believe that if there's anything that a government should do, it's to secure rights. And and so I think the ideal of most classical liberals of the minarchist variety, so not anarchist, but people who believe in a state, but believe that it should be the bare minimum state, what's often called a night watchman state, that they're only the only thing that they do is secure rights. So basically, it's what Leonard Read referred to as keeping the peace. So that's basically handling, courts and just, when someone steals from another person, forcing that person to provide restitution to the person stolen from, and defending people from murderers, and just protecting person and property. Now, the question is, though, how to prevent such government from going beyond that, from using that power not to protect property, but to plunder person and property. It's like one of the founders said something to the effect of, like, one of the problems of government is how do you get it to limit itself? And the way I put it is like, okay, you want a night watchman state. Well, who watches the night watchman? Like that's a spin on a classic Latin phrase, of classic Latin motto of, like, who watches the watchman. And so I think you're right that libertarians haven't come up with a working model for a minarchist state, because, like, how do you keep it minarchist? Like, when when it has a monopoly of force in a jurisdiction, how do you keep it from abusing that monopoly to aggrandize itself and its lackeys at the expense of the governed? And when they have a monopoly of force, and so there's no appeal, there's no higher level of appeal, like it's sitting in judgment over its own cases against anyone who has a complaint against them. So I think that definitely is a problem. I have this article called "The Iron Law of Kleptocracy," and in that article, I talk about the origin story of the state that's in the Declaration of Independence, because it was based on John Locke's origin theory of the state, and that's this idea that people come together and create government in order to protect their rights. But there's a conquest theory of the state developed by Robert Oppenheimer and other theorists, who instead posit the notion of a state as basically being a group of conquerors who, instead of completely killing and despoiling their victims and then just leaving them to die or just moving off, that they settle among their victims, and booty becomes tribute, and tribute becomes taxation, and they only protect the victims for the same reason that a shepherd protects his sheep, not for the sake of the sheep, but for the sake of the shepherd's wool and mutton. And so, that's the origin story of the state that I think is much more likely. And so I think that that's the inherent nature of the state, that it was developed for predation in the first place. And so, like, the idea that you're going to tame it and make it this security force is just naive. So I am an anarcho-capitalist, but I do think that anarcho-capitalists have not a theory of libertarian government in the traditional sense, but a theory of libertarian governance. It's positing that you don't need a monopoly government, that instead that people have a right to self-defense, and people have a right to hire other people to defend them. They have a right to hire security forces, but you don't necessarily have to have a monopoly security force because in a free market for security, such security forces would naturally want to make deals with each other, because ultimately it's not good for business if they're constantly going to war with other security forces. But if we had a free market for security, like a free market for governance, I think that would work. And I think that to some degrees, and in some aspects, it has worked. Like it hasn't been ever completely implemented, but different parts of that, like there have been competing courts and competing judges and competing security services, like in various ways throughout history, and it's worked. It's worked very well to the extent that it was implemented. So I do think that anarcho-capitalist libertarians have a realistic theory of government. It's not perceived as realistic, but I think that's what a big part of the job that we have before us is to develop that theory and to show people how it is realistic.
Well, if I
Yeah.
may, Dan,
Mhm.
what you just outlined to me is exactly what I consider the problem of libertarianism. Because what, again, if we start with the minarchist vision of society, of government, the issue, what happens is, if I'm an advocate of that, what the reason it doesn't work, or the reason it keeps leading to big government, is the limited government offers me the possibility of obtaining certain things through coercion, and the coercion is laundered through a collective body, through legislation and through government, so I can still feel good about myself. And that is so tempting that once I realize that that's a possibility, and that my fellow citizens will let me launder my coercion through a collective organization, the temptation for me to use that for other things aside from just the first few things that we established, public roads, common defense, a court system, you can't expect humans to abstain from a temptation so large as using coercion laundered in order to obtain the next most important thing. So the next most important thing would be currency, or public education, or publicly funded healthcare. So I just see it as a human nature issue, that once we agree that, hey, Adam, I'm going to offer you the chance here to get what you want, not without, you don't have to do anything. You just have to harness your fellow citizens. And we already have these 20 things we're doing. Do you have a proposal for number 21? And I'm going to say, heck yes, unless I have a strong conviction against that type of arrangement. And this society in the last 200 years is empirical proof that our fellow citizens have not resisted that temptation. Then we say, okay, well, what's a libertarian form of government? And then you said, well, anarcho-capitalism, where society allows libertarians to have their own, society agrees to break its monopoly on violence and share it with libertarians so that they can have their own violent apparatus, their own police force. And to me, the reason that's unrealistic is, if I take 1,000 things that society might allow me to do, I think I'd have a much better chance of having society allow me to build a casino in the middle of the town that I live in, than to say to non-libertarian society, will you let me have my own police force with my own people with guns? So when I say that we're forced into a conundrum where we either agree to the principle of limited government, which leads to all-out government, which has in the last 200 years, or we're forced into unrealistic imaginings of government, it doesn't mean that in the abstract there's anything wrong with the abstraction of it, that there's anything wrong. I mean, I agree with the idea of hiring my own private protection, but it's unrealistic in the sense that there's no, out of the 100 things that society might let me do as a libertarian, breaking their monopoly on violence would be the very last one they're going to allow. So that would be all-out war. If I tried to break their monopoly on violence, that's what is ensuring all of the other things that they're going to do, is their monopoly on violence. So they're smart people. They know that, and I know that. So therefore, to me, that's the problem of government, so libertarians can't get past that. So all we can do then is say, well, what about this kind of government? This would be nice. Well, then we can write lots of books about it and we can discuss it. But it's not it can't happen, because it's far too important of a social institution for mainstream society or non-libertarian society to relinquish. So we're in that conundrum now, and indeed they have not. So the empirical evidence is that if we agree to a minimal government, it'll expand to big government. Empirically has happened. If we propound an imaginary libertarian government, it won't be allowed. Empirical evidence, it hasn't happened. So the problem of government, and we're back to libertarianism 101, where there's two choices, and we have not. both of them are bad. One is an imaginary government that we don't have that's libertarian. One is a government that's expanding that we do have that's becoming on the road to communism. So I will maintain that is an outstanding problem. We could say it's solved abstractly if society would allow us to do it. But in my mind, that our theory has to incorporate society as it is, not society that we think it could be in 100 years or 50 years, where they say, guys, we've thought about it more and we've tried all our ways and they're not working. Why don't we allow you to have your own force, your own police force? And they know that would mean that there could be a conflict between police forces. In other words, no opposing party wants to allow the other party to have equal force or even a threat of a force. So it's unrealistic in the sense that we couldn't expect, we don't have any empirical reason to expect that society will allow any form of libertarian government that asserts an important value like not having to pay taxes, having our own police force or our own army. Those super important pillars of mainstream society would be the last that they would relinquish. And so we're back to square one. We're back to where we have an imaginary government or an expanding mainstream government.
So, what do you think is the basic orientation of libertarianism?
Thank you for asking. So I think the fundamental core of libertarian philosophy that's common to all schools of libertarian philosophy is, I would contend that most or all libertarians agree on a market-based economy as opposed to a command economy, number one. And number two, most or all libertarians agree that there's something with the phenomenon of force or aggression or coercion that mainstream society sees differently than libertarians do. So if I look at all the brands of libertarianism or all the schools, I think we're all in agreement that mainstream society says, well, we're just going to use coercion or force or aggression to obtain everything. In other words, we're going to use it to get food, apartments, healthcare, the roads, court system. In other words, to them, it's indiscriminate. As long as we vet it through government, the use of force, coercion, or aggression is justified. Whereas I think libertarians think that they try to circumscribe when the use of force is justified and when it's not. So I would say those two things define libertarianism as a broad school. And then how you conceive libertarianism then separates into differing schools. As a simple example, there's the Cato libertarians, that are involved with, more with educational establishment. And as you mentioned, there's anarcho-capitalists. There's natural rights, for example. And I don't have really a name for my brand of libertarianism, but it is not anarcho-capitalism. It is not based on the natural law. It's not rights-based in a sense. I don't try to come up with a justification or a rationale for individual rights. It's not part of my thinking. So I see libertarianism as a broad movement which seeks to limit government or expand individual autonomy. And within that, there are various schools, which I think sometimes people conflate a particular school of libertarianism with libertarianism. Anyway, so I'll pause here for a second if there's any comments you had on that. Otherwise, I can continue.
I'm curious how those core beliefs of all libertarians of the market economy over the command economy and aversion to coercion, how those can be conceived of or formulated without the notion of rights, because it seems that unless you have a notion of property rights, of like what ownership is, then you can't have a notion of private ownership of the means of production, which is what capitalism and market economy is. And coercion taken as like unjust coercion, like I don't understand how you could separate coercion from non-coercion without understanding rights. It's like if you don't own yourself, what does it even mean to say that someone is coercing you? Like if your body is just as much can be utilized by someone else as much as you, if you don't have a right to your body, then like how is that coercion? How is that not just somebody using something that's available to them?
Good question, and I think again we're back to kind of what I'm considering as the issue at hand, is that what you're saying in a sense is that you identify libertarianism as a theory of rights, as rights theory, libertarian rights theory, which I see as a school of libertarianism. So to answer your question directly, I see coercion not as something that's just or unjust, but just as a category of human action. So coercion, as I understand it, is a form of trade. So if I approach a person with a trade, I can say, "Hey, John, I'd like to help you achieve the next thing you're trying to get." And John says, "Oh, great, because I'm trying to get some money." I say, "Well, I have some money." And then John says, "Well, okay, Adam, what can I give you?" And I say, "Well, I'm kind of hungry." So he says, "Well, I'll give you something to eat." So we trade for our next most important values, let's say. But in coercion, I have the option to coerce somebody else. Everybody has that option if they want to do it. So in that case, what I do is I say, "You know what? I'm going to threaten to harm you, John." And John says, "Well, geez, looks like you might succeed in that. So is there anything I can do to stop you from harming me?" And I say, "Well, yes. If you give me that meal that we're talking about, then I won't harm you." And John says, "Well, that sounds like a good deal. I'll give you the meal." So coercion to me um, can be approached as Mises would have counseled as a value-free form of human action. It's available to all of us. Of course, as libertarians, what binds us as libertarians is we think that it's not quite right. There's something wrong with using coercion against somebody else, but we do it. We reserve the right to use it when we think it's uh, appropriate. So the way I see it is coercion is universally employed form of human action. And coercion, coincidentally, happens to be what's preventing a libertarian society, because if there was no threat of government coercion, I could start to make voluntary agreements with my fellow citizens. So the way I see it is that if there were a way to be found to lower coercion generally, regardless of the justification or the rightness or wrongness of it, if coercion could be lowered in society in general, then the flip side of that would be voluntary agreements would increase. So my theory of libertarianism does not involve a theory of rights. It starts with the phenomena of coercion, realizing that it's a trade or the type of exchange that humans utilize. And then I look to see, well, is there a way to lower the incidence of coercion in society in general, which would automatically increase the amount of freedom in society in general? So that it bypasses a theory of rights or a theory of justification or a theory of any property theory or property of ownership that certain schools of libertarian thought adhere to. But I don't. It's just not part of my thinking. It's
Well, without a theory of rights, why couldn't you say that in that that example of coercion that you have, that um, that the person who is making the threat, that if he, what was he get? He was getting food from the guy. Was that the example?
Well, yeah, just say I'm approaching someone and I want food from them. I can offer them something that they can specify. In other words, we can cooperate in a positive manner where John is going to get something that he wants for the food, but I don't have to do that. I could threaten him with a harm and then say, listen, for that food, if you want me to withdraw the harm, give me the food. That's coercion. So I have both options. So
what if the person who originally had the food, he farmed it, like he raised the food and he planted it and he like he did everything that what libertarians who believe in rights would say, give him the right to be the owner of that food. But if you don't have a rights theory, you could just as well say that, like, well, even though you planted and harvested that food, this person who had nothing to do with it, I think that's my food. And so I'm just like, in terms of like voluntariness, that you are keeping me away from my food because you and so you so I want you to take it. I want you to give it to me, and that's voluntary in the sense that the person who thinks that they have a claim to the food, that it's voluntary for them. Like, how is that not voluntary then?
well, I think what we're saying is you're painting a picture of rights theory the way that you see how it works, and then saying, well, how would that be approached with just from the pure theory of something being voluntary? I mean, I don't think I'm not prepared to critique rights theory fully, to go delve into what I see in a more detailed way, let's say. I'm just saying that arguing for the point of view that uh, my point is that libertarianism has been or can be conflated with a specific rights theory that, in my mind, is a school of libertarianism. And we don't have a libertarian society, so nobody's theory of libertarianism has resulted in a libertarian society. So from that point of view, all theories of libertarianism are equal as far as results. But my gripe with society is not that I don't look to the legislation to see what rights are enshrined for me, though I do, as a historical matter, I do count on them. I want to have my First Amendment, Second Amendment rights, etc., based on the fact that if I didn't have those, we'd be in a communist society right now. But to me, those are historical developments that favor me, those rights that I have in the traditional system. But my libertarian philosophy is not based on rights. It's based on whether, when somebody approaches me to obtain something from me, whether it's voluntary or whether it's coerced. For example, when we had the vaccine controversies, the proposal of mainstream society was that I would take the vaccine or I would suffer a penalty. I could avoid the penalty by taking the vaccine. So it was just coercion. It was very simple. I understood it 100% what it was. I understood what the proposition was. And so as a logical matter, if I were able to lower the incidence, let's say that I could prove that everybody who coerces somebody else loses 100 brain cells or something like that, something silly. And I could prove that. Then I could show people, well, you don't want to coerce me because every time you do, you're going to lose 100 brain cells. And I could show the benefit to them of not coercing me. And then if coercion were to diminish, I would be able to start to form voluntary relationships that are now outlawed. I mean, for example, you and I cannot agree to pay each other $5 an hour. It's technically against the law. So if coercion were no longer, if coercion were lowered, that would automatically um, provide more latitude for voluntary agreements. Now, we could talk about the flaws of that or the ins and outs of that. What I'm saying is that, to me, in my mind, since I have a mature non-rights-based theory of libertarianism, I know as a matter of fact that libertarianism does not equate to a natural rights or rights theory. I know that the school of libertarianism, um, as another example of that, I'll give two examples we talked about before, but when the technologists ask to be free to innovate, they're basically just inconsistent libertarians, because they're saying, listen, we're not hurting anybody. We're developing all these amazing products. Why don't you just let us innovate and leave us alone? And which is great as far as it goes. But what they're saying is just do it in our area, don't do it in others. So it's just inconsistent libertarianism, which I reject as an overall libertarian philosophy, even though I support them in their quest to attain freedom for themselves. I don't see it as a valid libertarian theory overall. Second example would be Bitcoin, which is, in my mind, 100% a libertarian technology. It's meant to. It was designed to protect the individual's assets against collectively organized confiscation. And the person, as far as I know, the person who developed it doesn't have a worked out theory of rights, or doesn't subscribe to any of the rights-based libertarian philosophers, but yet was able to devise and implement a libertarian technology. So to me, libertarianism is the quest to be free of coerced conformance, however that may be theorized or conceived. And so then it's a matter of competing theories. In other words, under the general guise of don't coerce me and let the market be, there are multiple umbrella theories that can say, well, here's how we see that coming around. I see it coming around from rights. I can see it coming around from cryptography. I see it coming around from et cetera, et cetera. But that's my contention. Now, apparently it's controversial. But my point is that that's, to me, one of the things holding back libertarianism, is that anybody who that if to become a libertarian, you have to go down the rights path and start to learn the language and the theories of rights theory. And if there were anything wrong with that theory, then then that could explain why we're not seeing results as far as tangible results in society.
Well, I'm just wondering if rights are implicit in your own theory without you realizing it. So, and I think it depends on what you mean by coercion too. So let's call A the person who threatened the other person and basically coerced the other person to give him food, give him food. Now let's say that, and so the coercer is A and the coerced is B. Let's say that instead of A coercing B, A actually just went to B's farm and just helped himself to some of the food from B's
Theft, for
farm.
example.
Right.
Or just brute force, let's say.
Mm-hmm. And then let's say that B made a threat to A saying, give me back my food, or I will use violence against you. Is that coercion according to your definition of coercion?
The reason for choosing coercion as the focus of libertarian social theory is because if you agree that libertarian social theory is about the relationship between the individual and the government, then the question is, well, what is the government doing? What's the essential thing that the government does that if the government didn't do that, I could proceed in my life the way I want to proceed? So the way I would answer your question is, I'm not, as a libertarian, I'm not really concerned with the crime that my neighbor might commit. I, I think it's an interesting topic, and I'm definitely against my neighbor committing crime against me. But when as a libertarian, that's not what's stopping me from having voluntary agreements. Is not my neighbor, that he might pillage me or harm me physically, assault, murder, whatever the physical harms that my neighbor can do to me, or theft or fraud that my neighbor could do to me. Those aren't my concerns as a libertarian. My concern as a libertarian is, what is the government essentially doing that's stopping me from having the kind of agreements with my fellow citizens that I want to have that have been outlawed? And I have reached the conclusion that it's not actually assault or fraud or plundering or pillaging per se that the government's doing. What the government's doing is it coerces me. So what it does is there's a legislation, and the legislation says, Adam, here's the harms. It's always a fine, license revocation, physical restraint, imprisonment, or bodily harm. So there's just a list of harms. And the government says, Adam, we have a deal for you. We've passed legislation with these various harms, and here's how you can avoid those harms by doing what we say. So they say, in other words, the government is not, I've actually never had, or very rarely had, an actual instance of force or fraud directly with a government agent, but I have been coerced by government for almost my whole adult life by the process I was just describing.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. It's not so much that taxation is theft. It's more accurate to say that taxation is extortion, and that, like, Rothbard said that the state is a gang of thieves writ large, and you could also say that the state is an extortion racket writ large. But I'm still curious if you think that B threatening A with violence if A doesn't return the food that he took from his farm, if that qualifies as coercion to you.
The way I see it is, since I'm not a rights theorist, and since I don't pursue that school of libertarian thought, I'm not interested in deciding who's right or wrong in the use of, regardless whether you want to call it coercion or force or aggression. My interest is not in deciding something that a judge would want to know, which is who rightfully
I'm not
used
talking
for.
about.
Okay.
I'm not talking about judge or rightfully. I'm talking about your own ends and your own definition of libertarianism, because you think libertarianism is a minimization of coercion, and you want to minimize coercion. So I think it's important what coercion is and what qualifies as coercion. So, like, is that instance coercion?
Well, I distinguish between coercion and assault and murder. For example, to me, if somebody just murders somebody, that's just murder. It's not. I don't see it as a social trade, and I don't see assault. When you see the pictures of somebody getting assaulted in a major city on the sidewalk, that's tragic and it's brutal, and it's something I'd like to avoid, and I'd like to not have nobody have to ever experience that. But I don't see it as a libertarian problem. I see that as just pure physical violence. But coercion is the way, is the technique, is a universal mode of human action, which is that.
Right. So is the farmer using that mode? Is the farmer coercing if he's threatening the person who took food from
Like
his
if somebody
farm.
steals something from me and now I turn around and say, if you don't give it back, I'm going to shoot you, then I'm coercing them. So, but the way I would approach that is that that whether I use coercion or whether somebody else uses coercion, if in society there was less coercion, including the government kind, then that would automatically provide more opportunities for voluntary interaction. So that if I were able to find a way to reduce the general level of coercion, regardless of who's committing it, in other words, forget whether somebody's justified or whether we can define it as that. Just if we agree on what it is, which maybe we haven't right now, but I feel confident that I could establish a definition of coercion as something that's universally practiced, because all governments are doing what I define as coercion. They're offering a harm, threatening a harm, and then they're offering to withhold the harm in exchange for obedience from the citizen. That's a coercive trade. So they're all doing that. So if we as libertarians could find a way to lower the use of coercion, find a way that was less used, then just out of logic, that would mean that people would be able to proceed with voluntary transactions. So the point in bringing that up is not to establish my theory of that, but is to say that there are alternative ways of approaching libertarianism than the rights-based theory. And that means that the rights-based theory is a school within libertarianism. So Rothbard, Rand, and the approach of the Mises Institute is a school of libertarianism, right or wrong. Maybe they'll be the prevailing school. Maybe they'll be turned out that they were intellectually correct and their theory wins the day. But it's a school within libertarianism. Um, so that's my contention. So apparently it's controversial and maybe not universally accepted, but that's what we'll be advocating, or what I would advocate to my fellow libertarians, that one of the reasons libertarianism may be being held back is because entry into libertarianism is being considered synonymous with entry into rights theory. And I think that's a mistake. I think that my preference for a market-based economy and my preference not to be coerced is not identical to libertarian rights theory. So my preference for a market-based economy and my feeling that when I'm coerced, something's wrong with that does not mean that I have to answer it through libertarian rights theory. And I don't, and I haven't. And I have my theory of libertarianism is pretty advanced and pretty mature at this point, with something we can go into one day. But um, in our discussion, you can see how it's a difficult thing for libertarians who have been schooled in the rights theory to see, because there essentially haven't been competing theories within the libertarian school, and I don't think that's a good thing. It should have, in my thinking, it should have been a competition, competing theories, but apparently it hasn't been in the United States. And I have my reasons why I think that's so, but I think it's holding us back. I think we'd be better served with competing theories, and then there would be an interchange and a chance for correcting mistakes and a chance for reconceiving things. And we don't have that right now. We have libertarianism is identified in the minds of many people with libertarian rights theory, and that leads you back to certain philosophers and their worldviews, and which I tend to disagree with. I'm opponents of some of those thinkers, as you maybe know. I'm an opponent of those libertarians in their theories, not them personally. So
What about human nature? What kind of a role do you think human nature plays in whether someone is a libertarian or not?
the way I see it is that, and I think that differs from other social thinkers. Um, I think really, in essence, you only have two choices, and I think experience bears me out. Um, you as you can see in the world, when we go in the world and we look at all the different nation states, we see that there's quite often, I mean, I know it's true in the United States, I know it's true in England, I know it's true in Germany, that there's two sides to the political, there's two factions, two large factions. And I don't think that that's accidental or random. My contention is that the two factions are manifestations of two sides of human nature, and that every person, every human being has to choose one of those sides to default to. It doesn't mean that every day we can't get up and when things are going well, we can pick and choose one side of our nature or the other side of our nature. But when it really comes down to important things, we have to make, and there's only two sides, you have to choose one, and then it becomes crucial when it becomes an important issue. Politics is very important, especially in these days. And so you have to choose whether you're on one side of the aisle or the other. And I think that the derivation or the source of that divide is essentially that each person only has one direct experience of consciousness, and all the other experiences of consciousness that one assumes are happening in the world are all secondhand. So if I look at the other people in my life and the other people that I know and talk to and exchange with, I assume that they have a firsthand experience of consciousness, but I myself never experience it. So that's the fundamental divide. So that means that when I grow up or when I start to mature, I have to make important decisions whether to prioritize or trust my firsthand conscious experiences, or the communicated experiences of the secondhand consciousnesses that communicate with me. So to say it succinctly, whether to trust my own individual consciousness or the collective, without using it as a pejorative, the collective, meaning the other consciousnesses that communicate to me that I don't experience. And no one can avoid that. In other words, however you want to phrase it, however anybody wants to conceive it from their own point of view, it's an unavoidable phenomenon, because at the end of the day, I only experience my mind, my consciousness experiences things very real and very are real to me. The experiences of other people are secondhand to me. They report them, but I don't experience them. So that explains the divide in politics between collectivism and individualism, which hopefully I can convince most libertarians that leftism's based on collectivism. I hope I can succeed in that. On the libertarian side, it's more complex. And the reason is, historically, the libertarian side has also included religious people, so that people who are members of an organized religion interpret human individuality in terms of a soul or in terms of their religion, so that what ends up happening in society is that it seems to be a fight between collectivism. Leftism gets to be leftism. It gets to be the collective will. The individual gets subverted. But because of the historical nature of our society and how our society came to be through Western religion, what appears that leftism is trying to subvert is religion. But my contention would be that leftism tries to subvert religion only as a particular form of individualism. In other words, to the extent that religion accentuates the individual human soul, leftism tries to subdue that. But even if I have no theory of a soul, if me as not a member of an organized religion, I still get to be included in the individual that's subdued by leftism. In other words, leftism, if I say, well, listen, I'm not a member of any religion, so don't try to subsume me within to the benefit of the collective. They say, well, I'm sorry. All people who express individualism in any form even you, even if you're not a member of an organized religion. So I see that what's confused things for the theory of libertarianism is that we've tended to see the fight between leftism or collectivism and the most populist group of individualists, which by historical fact have been religious people, which is fine, which is a historical fact. So all of our founding fathers and all of our fellow citizens up till today that are on the other side of the aisle and defending against organized collectivism from an individualist perspective, or protecting individual rights, as you would say, or small business, or against COVID lockdowns, or for freedom of speech, as a historical fact, are coming from the religious, from a religious worldview. So let me just summarize before I keep rambling on that. But I see the difference as at its root, not the cultural, what I see as a cultural fact of religion, but a deeper, in my opinion, as I would say it. I don't want to say anything that overrules somebody else's worldview. That's not really my intent. My intent is to say that, as I see it, what collectivism is after is the subduing of the individual consciousness, trying to assert its place in the world or its priority. And that's the essential dividing mark. And that's what's manifesting. That's why we always see in Germany that the two parties are almost exactly matched. In England, there were Brexit and the Remain parties, it was almost 50-50. And in the United States, we're almost 50-50. Why is that? Oh, is that just a random accident? It's not a random accident. It's because there's two sides to human nature. Either I want to assert my conscious reality, or I am willing to defer to the collective secondhand consciousness of others as communicated to me. And that's a fundamental choice that we all have to grapple with in our personal lives. When we grow up, we just assume that our consciousness is the only thing, and we're taught culturally, well, no, Adam, share your toys, or no, be nice to Johnny because you just hurt his feelings. If nobody taught me that, I'd still be out there stealing their toys and hurting their feelings, because I only experience my own consciousness. So culturally, I was taught to respect secondhand consciousness. And I'm not complaining. I'm saying, I think, I do want to walk amongst my fellow human beings and be, somewhat liked or whatever. But I was trained culturally about secondhand consciousness. I never experienced one, but I was taught by society, by my parents, to take into consideration what I, from my point of view, is a secondhand experience of consciousness that I never experienced myself. So that's the dividing line. Libertarianism is the attempt to carve out a space for that individual consciousness, as opposed to the collectivism, which is an attempt to circumvent and circumscribe or limit that. And it's within each one of us. So anyway, so that I talked long enough on that.
So wouldn't not taking someone's toys be more consistent with libertarianism?
Well, I'm not talking about as when you become an adult and when you mature and your intellect gets applied to your actions. I just mean before your intellect gets applied to your actions, when you're a child, when you just act based on what you experience in the moment, before you've been intellectualized or culturized, let's say, that I would argue, if somebody wants to dispute that, but I would argue that you're selfish. But I don't think that's not because you're morally bad. It's because you we're just going with your own experiences. So, oh, I see a toy, I want the toy, because my consciousness sees something. There's an object over there. There's another object. There's another person, but that's just another object. From my point of view, that's just another object. It's only later in life that somebody says, well, no, that other object has feelings like you do. Oh, okay, I see. But I mean, I don't think I knew that when I was 3 years old. I was you just grab for whatever you grab. And so that's my argument. Somebody could have a different theory of childhood development. But I think that what we are in society is that the individual consciousness has become, because of certain philosophers. If you go into philosophy and you hear about Nietzsche, for example, and that's just automatically what that means is a theory of consciousness by which people become monsters. I mean, it's just, in other words, that it's just assumed that there can't be a theory of social cooperation in which the individual consciousness is the focal starting point for the theory. So I'm pretty confident that if we debate this, I will be able to show that as a society, we're in agreement that any theory of social interaction has to start with a collective concept, because if it didn't, and it started with the individual, that the individual would become a monster, and then the words Nietzsche would come up quickly, and then the word Hitler would come up shortly thereafter. And so that to me is a failing of social philosophy to have a social theory that incorporates the reality of how one's consciousness feels to that person, and at the same time doesn't imply that they have to then become some sort of egomaniac maniac monster. We don't have that as a society. You can't become a maniacal, egotistical monster. Therefore, you have to have a collective theory of society. And then I would argue that's wrong. That's wrong. That is a problem. But the dividing line is that consciousness, is that we can't let the individual consciousness be the focal point of social theory, because that implies selfishness, disregard for our fellow humans, and lack of empathy, and all the litany of negative social qualities. So I would argue that's mistaken, and that's why we are where we are. Because if you think about that, if we can only have collective theories of social cooperation, you're not going to have a libertarian theory in that, because collective theories of social organization have as their specific purpose that they are devised specifically to prevent self-interest from being a focal point of social relations. So you're always going to then have, if you can't devise a theory of social interaction with the individual consciousness at the center, or if you like, individual soul at the center, then you're going to go for an alternate theory, which was designed to limit that individual consciousness or soul. It was purposely designed to surround it and to cut off the options. That's the politics we have today. That's why with each increase in the growth of government, our side keeps looking for the other side to admit that things are going wrong. And they're looking at us, they're saying, you guys are crazy. You still don't get it. These are all good developments. And we don't get it. So, for example, the fraud thing that's going on in Minnesota right now. I'm on social media and I keep reading, for everybody on the right side of the aisle keeps waiting for the other side of the aisle to be outraged by the huge scale of the fraud that's going on. And they just don't get it. The other side wants to limit the individual from developing past from growing out of the constraints of the collective. And so any movement anything that diminishes the individual, the achievers, the people who would break free, so to speak, from the grasp of collective controls, anything that helps in that movement is a benefit. So if there's an entire class of people who are perceived as achievers or as who want to proceed without permission beyond the constraints of a collective vision, any movement that takes their assets and transfers them to the collective itself, that from which they would be escaping or from advancing past, is a good from that point of view. And we keep saying, well, by this standard, it's terrible. There's fraud, there's crime, they're not getting that from the alternative point of view, these are all good developments. We forget that when communism was at its height, which was the full manifestation of collectivism, business was called profiteering. I don't know if you may remember that. Business was called profiteering. What is profiteering? That meant if you go collect a whole bunch of components of a product, you better not try to sell them for more than the components that you paid for. Otherwise, you're profiteering. That's how people survive. It's called business. So from their point of view, that was a negative. Or as you may recall, Dan, the original goal of leftism was to eliminate the price system. I mean, that was the original goal. In other words, that's why Mises wrote socialism. We forget that the original socialist theories, which they had to abandon because the societies fell apart when they were tried in Russia and in China, the societies were disintegrating. That was the attempt to eliminate the price system and assign everything by committee, assign goods and services by committee. So, my point in saying that is we forget how they see things from the opposite angle because their goal is different. Their goal is not to advance the individual soul or consciousness or individual person. Their goal is to control the individual. And so where does that, and my contention is that comes from the very most fundamental aspect of human nature, which is the fact that we only have one firsthand experience of consciousness. And so then we have to choose. So you're always going to have another side of the aisle because you're always going to have somebody who said, who am I to say something when there's all these other consciousnesses around me? I'm a minuscule grain of sand in the millions of consciousnesses that are surrounding me. Therefore, I will defer. The opposite side will say, I see that there's probably all these other consciousnesses around me, but there's only one that I'm 100% sure of, and I'm going to go with that. And that's the divide. So my point in bringing that up is not to say that's a good or a bad thing, is that that's not going to change. We're always going to have that other side who's going to be trying to limit individual liberty. And we're always going to have our side, which is always going to try to have the individual prosper. And so that's our beginning. That's not going to change, is my argument. So therefore, we have to accept that. That's the beginning conditions. That's not something we can change through argument. If that's the case, we can have some ebbs and flows. We can have 1776 versus 1976. But even then, it's going to be 50-50 because whether you put us in 1976 or 1776, you're going to have 50% of the people who want to move now in the collectivist direction and 50% who want to move in the individualist direction, no matter where in history you place us. Because as in human nature, we have that divide, whether to subvert our firsthand experience to the communicated experience of others or to assert our firsthand experience in contradiction to the reported experiences of others. I'm not saying that everybody should start asserting themselves over the collective, because you can be wrong and maybe you're too timid to do that. Maybe that's not who you are. Then you may end up on the other side of the aisle and you're my political opponent in a way, because you're trying to, because of the decision you made with respect to your consciousness and how you saw it, you don't want to let people like me do the other choice, which is to heed or exemplify or manifest our individual consciousness. The other side of the aisle says, well, we don't like that decision. That fundamental decision you made, we don't like that decision. So we're going to try to limit that decision. We're going to make sure that that decision doesn't do the bad things that we say it must. And from my point of view, it's like, no, yes, there have been bad people in the past on both sides of the aisle, by the way, but no, you're prejudging me. You don't have proof that because I have a consciousness and I experience it and want to try to manifest it, that I'm going to become a monster. You're assuming that, but you haven't proved that. And I take issue with that because I'm living my life, a good life as I see it. And so, no, I'm not going to agree. So I'm going to become an opponent of the attempt to stop what I see as a natural part of myself, which is to translate my conscious experiences and have them manifest into physical reality in the same way, or the physical world the same way that the other side of the aisle wants to manifest their fundamental choice in the political sphere. So I want to manifest my choice that I made into the political sphere. So my point is that those two things are never going to go away. We're going to have that struggle. And so therefore, as libertarians, we need to solve that problem. In other words, our solutions have to incorporate that's always going to be with us. And so I have proposed that, again, I propose that in what I write, how we could structure that.
So given that assumption that that's not going to change, what do you think libertarians' goals should be?
So I think that libertarians should, now we're in the normative field now, this is not descriptive and it's prescriptive. So now we're talking about norms and competing theories of libertarian action. In other words, I could be wrong, or it could be that somebody will just never agree with me, and that's fine. So it's competing. Libertarians are competing with each other and advancing their various ideas for what we should do. But I would say, if I look right now at society, and I keep mentioning these institutions, but if you look at the New York Times or Harvard University or the press, for example, mainstream press, it's clear to me that they have no interest in individual liberty. It's clear to me that they're driving towards an ever-increasing political atmosphere of restricted individual liberty and expanding government. So two easy examples. In the last 5 years, we've both experienced the attempt to limit free speech or to abolish free speech, basically to regulate speech, as one example. The press was 100%, mainstream press 100% on board with that. American educational institutions, colleges, 100% in agreement with that. Our government on the other side of the aisle, 100% in agree with that. Europe, 100% in agreement with that. So what they're doing is they're only coming up with, they're using all of their intellectual powers to devise restrictions and new laws and new mandates. So I take that as that's a fact. When I look at my social thought, I have devoted no time to devising new restrictions and mandates and controls. None. And I don't think that's an accident, that both of those facts are true. So I'm just trying to figure out how to liberate myself or other like-minded people. So again, going back to that fundamental divide, either you're on one side of that or the other. So why can't we have an overall theory by which we accept that non-libertarian society is motivated by, is animated by, and pursues with vigor and zeal the introduction of new mandates and controls and restrictions, and just accept that based on their fundamental choice they made, which was a collective choice at the root of human nature to defer to collective interests over the individual interest. And that manifests in their wanting to control the individual behavior, which they have been doing and succeeding at. And then the libertarian side would focus only on developing liberty. Just admit that I will admit to myself that I have no interest. I don't really want to control anybody. It's not that I've tried it and I can't do it. It's not that I think that I would have no success. I actually have no interest. But I'm averse to it. I think I'm averse to it because I don't like being controlled, and therefore, I'm not saying I'm a perfect human being and that I don't control people. If someone can point out where I do control people, good for them. But it's certainly not something that I'm trying to find. I'm not trying to develop the technology of it or trying to develop new ideas around it and trying to perfect the craft of it. The other side of the aisle is doing that. They're trying to perfect the craft of it. It's funny because one aside for, like, when I say perfecting the craft, it's all the techniques. For example, it's common knowledge today that the mainstream press won't report on any subject that mitigates against their goals. But that technique has already been named in non-libertarian scholarship. It's called strategic silence. In other words, the idea that we won't mention anything in any literature we control. We just won't mention any fact that contradicts our theory. That's not in other words, they're doing that. That's a purposely devised technique of control that's being devised by the other side. So I don't want to do selective strategic silence. To me, that's deceptive. To me, that's non-transparent and dishonest. I don't want to pursue the strategy of that. To me, it's kind of beneath me. I don't understand. I don't know how a self-respecting person could do that. But I accept that if your goal is a society of full government control, and that's your number one goal or value, I understand how you could subsume other values within that, so that integrity or transparency would be a lower value, which would be sacrificed for the higher value of political conformity. So what's happening on the collectivist side of the aisle, as opposed to the libertarian side, is that the political goal of full political conformity is the top goal, whereas we libertarians don't see it that way. A Christian has goals, and I mentioned this before in our discussion. A Christian has goals above political conformity. I have goals above political conformity. My integrity is more important than my loyalty to a group narrative, let's say, or to 100% group allegiance. So it would be very difficult for me to lie for my political team. I lost my train of thought. Anyway, I think I got off the narrative.
So do you see a complementary role between these two technologies, as you call them? Like, do you see like a division of labor that's possible there?
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. In other words, I'm saying that we should accept I think it's a really neat solution to the libertarian problem, because when we started, we said libertarians don't have they're put into two positions. If they themselves agree to limited government, then they set the whole temptation thing, which leads to expanded government. So minarchism leads to expanding government. Dude, it's human nature. It's not just the immoral people. It's the temptation's too large. And it's that if we all have agreed that we can use government and coerce people for this, nature does not provide the stopping point for that. It's only so it's only natural that if we say three things can be used to coerce people for three things, Why can't it be 4 things? I mean, there's a million things. Why can't you do 4? Well, if you can do 4, why can't you do 5? So in 1776, we start with 6 or 7 things. Now in 1976, we're up to 120 things. So it's pretty, okay, so that's one thing. Now, the other one is to propose forms of libertarian government that are unrealistic in the sense that in our lifetime, they're never going to happen. So the solution to that could be to accept that non-libertarian society provides government solutions to things for better or worse, and libertarians provide the liberty from that. But we have not done that so far. So that's work yet to be done. But so therefore, our theory of government becomes those guys do that. We don't do that. We don't have to come up with our own theory of government. It's the division of labor. Depending on what choice you made when you were young or when you were in your 20s or whenever you wanted to make, whatever you made that choice, that you wanted to let me innovate or let me be free or stop telling me what to do. Whenever you made that choice, whether you made it when you were 4 years old or when you made it when you're 24, or whether you made it when you're 44 years old, you are now concerned with liberties, and you're developing forms of liberty. Whenever you decided that you think that the individuals should defer to the collective, you decided that your goal was to control the individual. And that's what gave birth to our opponents in non-libertarian society. In the United States, that's, in my opinion, we just call it what I think it is, which is the leftism. But if somebody wants to use a different name and call it something else, fine. I'm not saying Republicans don't do that aren't part of non-libertarianism. I guess in my view, they are oftentimes non-libertarian, but libertarians tend to be on the right side of the aisle, and as I see it. So yes, it's a division of labor, and I'm arguing that we should make it explicit and realize that the solution to how to govern collectively doesn't have to be provided by people who are against collective governance. It can be provided by people who like that and who want to do that. And it's clear that the other side wants to do that, and they actually like doing that. And they are doing that. They're actually having success at it. But on the other side, we haven't had success at the part of the division of labor that we're supposed to be doing, which is developing liberties from that system. So for example, I think Bitcoin is a move in that direction. But so kind of the internet was for a while, right? When the internet came out, it had the promise that it was going to help in individual liberty or in liberty in general. And that's been muted somewhat by large companies, the extent to which they control the internet and are in turn controlled by regulation. So what happened was, or what's happened is that large corporations with HR departments are basically infiltrated. They're basically arms of the government. So to the extent that our internet providers are large companies, they necessarily are quasi-government officials, quasi-government organizations. And that's why we intuitively know that the internet's not as free as we had maybe hoped that it would be, because in a libertarian conception of the internet, it would just be a whole bunch of individuals interacting. And the platform would be kind of some neutral platform, an enabler, some platform that was not politically oriented. But that's not what we have. We have corporations, and the corporations are quasi-governmental, and that tends towards collectivism because the corporations are heavily regulated. So, for example, if there's DEI introduced through the government, that has to go into the corporation, and then that has to go into the internet to the extent the internet is run by corporations.
All right. Well, I think we've run out of time, but Adam, thank you so much for sharing more of your perspective and your system. Um, I enjoyed this. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I think what we saw is that there were things where we could pursue more, like the difference between rights theory and maybe different conceptions of libertarianism. And I know we weren't able to resolve that. We could always, that could be a topic for another day. Um, but what I was hoping to establish today is that um, that libertarianism, I would argue, should not be conflated. That there's a libertarian nature to humans, and the theory of what that nature is. Different schools of libertarianism will try to understand that or try to define that each in their own way. And I have a way that I like to try to describe it. And I know there's a traditional way that libertarians try to describe it. But my main point was that um, libertarian, I think, is a broad um, movement in social movement owing to a certain side of human nature. And maybe if we saw it that way, and then we could have within libertarianism different competing schools, and that might be advantageous to have an exchange of ideas within libertarianism, as opposed to kind of how I think it's been, which is that libertarianism is associated with traditional rights theory.